Seeking Level, Chapter 10. It didn't take long once they were finally all together again. For Keith, time always seemed to stop while they were in that space, that union that was Voltron. Sometimes he felt wrong about liking it so much, seeing as how whenever they needed Voltron something really horrible was happening, and yet his soul was usually at its most peaceful, submerged deep within the consciousness of the legendary defender. Today, however, today was not the same. He felt connected to his lion, connected to his team, but the physical space between them seemed too much right now. He still felt blind, as though he were trying to gauge his friends just from his sense of touch, with his gloves on. He wanted to see their faces, wanted to join with them in the castle instead of in spirit. For the first time, he wanted to disband and debrief. Fortunately, there wasn't much fight left in the Galra after the first warship exploded. Shiro seemed to think that they hadn't expected any of the lions to resurface after touching ground on the planet, and were unprepared for their return. No one ever kept count of how many fighters were lost in the battle, but plenty were left when the commander in charge ordered the retreat. They turned and swarmed away like locusts. Keith heard Pidge and Hunk cheer, felt his own emotions trying to stir into a sense of triumph or accomplishment, but this time there was only a bit of exhausted relief. Finally, done. He tried to take a deep breath. "Well done, team," Karan congratulated over the radio, the castle appearing like a new star in the periphery, particle barrier lowered. "Time to come in," the lions, splitting apart in order to return to her hangar in the castle, a process that felt to Keith like coming up into the cold after soaking in warm water, where his senses rearranged themselves to being a single unit instead of a whole. Things were dimmer, fuzzier, smaller, a little lonely, except for Red. They returned to Red's place in the castle without consciously thinking about it, Red tired and Keith processing. Keith exited via her mouth, then turned and rested against one of her enormous paws, not wanting to leave her alone, projecting his own need onto her. She felt different to him now, closer. He owed her so much. "You did it," he told her admiringly. "You got us out again." Such a dark, tight space, so close to giving up. She projected an emotion that was rather like patting him on the back, a warmth and pressure on his heart. "Will you be okay if I go? Will I be okay if I leave you?" "You're with me, no matter where you are," she assured him, feelings turning into words easier this time, as if Keith had picked up a second language, a souvenir of their ordeal. "Not so for the others. Go to them. You're worried about them," her soul pushed into his. "They're worried about you. Go. See and touch." She didn't fully comprehend this requirement, that he would physically need to be in their presence to reassure himself even after they had just been joined in Voltron. But as always, she didn't judge him for being small, for being not like her. Keith leaned completely against her paw, as much of an embrace as was possible for a paladin and his enormous sentient robot. "Thanks, Red," he told her. She nudged his heart, prompting him out of the room, and he flew to the bridge where he knew the others were gathering, eager to see them, anxious to hear what had happened while he'd been lost. His interlude with Red had put him a little behind the others, and the final door from the hangar bay opened to bustle. Karan was making concerned little squawking sounds, Pidge wide-eyed and quiet at his side, while Shiro made his way over to Hunk, who seemed to be just taking the first few steps from his hangar, Allura limp in his arms. Oh, Allura. Keith jerked on his heel to switch directions when he saw her, coming to Hunk's other side and placing his supportive hands underneath the yellow paladins, along with Shiro, all three of them bearing up the princess. Keith felt immediately guilty, remembering the tone of Allura's voice when she came to him in his lion. She looked so frail now. What had she done? "Let me through," Karan demanded. What had she done? "Let me through," Coran demanded, beginning to shoulder past the clump of paladins, pressing to be at Alora's side. "Alora!" "I'm all right," Alora murmured, not opening her eyes, the softness of her voice immediately quieting all quick motion in the room. Keith shifted, only slightly, to allow Coran physical access, feeling more than a little of Alora's weight transfer to the Altean. He noticed Shiro also giving way, until they were just the honor guard on the sidelines. Even Hunk let go, settling Alora on her feet, held up by Coran's tight grip around her waist and wrist as he pulled her arm over his shoulders. None of them took a step backward, but stood ready in case the princess faltered, in case they needed to catch her. Keith felt someone's fingers close on his shoulder, but he couldn't tear his eyes off Alora. He discovered that he was still angry with her, except now for a completely different reason. "So risky," Keith would have. "I know, Coran," Alora acknowledged, calmly and with sureness, looking at the ground now. "But it was the only way I could think of to get the Green Lion away from the planet. The risk needed to be taken. I only wish—" She trailed off, her eyes misting, some of her strength collapsing into the despair of the unspoken wish. Keith could guess what it was. If she'd taken on the planet to pull the Green Lion away, if she'd also used the power of her quintessence to lift him from its influence, it had been her last resort. Her initial intention, he was certain, would be to heal the planet, restore it to its natural, unbroken, pre-Galra state, as she had done before with the Balmera. But had she forgotten that when she did that she'd had an entire civilization helping her? That the Balmera was not drained completely as Malaya had been? And even then it had almost killed her. She needed to think these things through better. Sometimes some things were beyond saving. There were two hands on Keith now, a reassuring buzz near his ear. Someone was talking to him. Shiro, of course. "Relax," he was saying. "Fight's over. It's time to cool down." That's when he noticed how stiff he stood, how tight his jaw was, how hard he clenched his fists while glaring at Alora. How well Shiro could read him, even if he was mistaken about why Keith was acting this way. There had been a time when he'd needed verbal confirmation that violence was no longer required, that he could stand down. It wasn't that long ago either, and Shiro remembered. He couldn't know that Red had already soothed the battle out of him, that this was something completely different. He wanted to reach over and shake Alora for being so stupid and reckless. He wanted to take her hand and bow over it to thank her for being exactly that, angry at himself that he'd made it necessary. He forced his hands loose, jerking his shoulders a little to let Shiro know he'd heard him. "Room to rest," Coran was saying, as Keith tuned back in. They were moving now, Coran gently guiding Alora off the bridge toward her quarters where she could recover, restore whatever quintessence she'd lost in the spiritual battle she'd fought with Malaya. Keith's hand twitched as they moved past him, but he couldn't think of anything to say to her, so he let himself step back, eyes down, feeling Shiro give him one last reassuring clench before joining on Alora's other side to help her walk. "She'll be all right," Keith told himself, monitoring Shiro's smile as he looked at her, listening to Coran's continued mother-hen pecking as he breathed out his worry in a lecture all the way down the hall. If there were true danger, they would lead her in another direction. She wouldn't be awake and talking. Shiro wouldn't be smiling. He tried to breathe some of the calmness that was settling on the bridge. "It's going to be okay." Keith closed, trying to reassure himself that everything was over now, not quite ready to believe it. "We thought we lost you back there." "Yeah," he replied automatically, not looking at his teammate right away, until it dawned on him that he could finally hear what had gone on while he'd been buried in the dirt. "What happened?" He turned toward Hunk, noticing that Pidge was already in her normal seat, screen up, monitoring their surroundings for any straggling Galra ships, running a data set in the background on who knew what. Her world obviously returned to the normal she was comfortable in. He rather envied her ability to do that so quickly. "What did Alora do?" "Oh man, it was amazing," Hunk began to gush. "We were fighting, right? And she sort of went into this trance, all Altean mysterious and stuff. And she was talking, but not to us talking. But we could feel it." Pidge groaned a little ways off. making it clear that while her eyes were on her screens, she was still listening to what they were saying. It made Keith wonder if maybe she had to concentrate so hard on her program to keep the memories at bay. Maybe she wasn't as okay as she seemed. Had they seen it too? That thing in the dark. Had it come after them? Keith's chest hurt, but he didn't know exactly why. He felt like he was still trapped underground, like something was wrong, like he should be moving. Maybe he did need Shiro to talk him down after all. He crossed his arms in front of him as he listened, trying to pin his attention down. And anyway, we all started pushing against it in our minds, like moving a mountain, or... What did it feel like to you, Pidge? Hunk asked when his description fell short. Moving a mountain sounds accurate, Pidge concurred, her fingers slowing in their typing as she remembered. At first, it was like holding up a ceiling that was falling in on when Lance showed up. Lance, Keith said out loud, realizing immediately why he was still feeling so weird. He scanned the bridge, finally noticing the absence of the Blue Paladin. How had he just detected this now? And how many times had it happened before? Say, where is Lance, anyway? Hunk mused, sounding way too calm about it. A huge dead weight settled hard in Keith's core, the not-right feeling turning to cement once he knew what it was. Despite his insides turning to stone, he found himself moving quickly enough, sprinting towards Blue's hangar, leaving Pidge and Hunk behind without a word. He'd known it. Known ever since he came out of the healing pod that something wasn't right about Lance. Something wasn't right, and they hadn't had time to fix it, and no one was even paying attention, and Lance was such an idiot! And now he was probably unconscious in Blue, or worse. But how much worse? Lance! Keith shouted his concern ahead as he neared Blue's area. Come on, man, respond. How many more times was Lance going to do this to him? This ever-increasing sick feeling that came from wondering where he was, what had happened to him, if he were okay. A week ago, Keith hardly ever even noticed Lance, and now it seemed his entire world revolved around his well-being. He felt responsible for him, and the only reason he resented that was because Lance had suddenly made it his life's mission to mess with Keith's head. Keith slowed upon entering Blue's hangar, mentally preparing himself for what he might find there. Almost stopped when he saw Lance slumped on the floor between her paws, leaning his head against her, eyes closed, one of his hands resting at the back of his neck, the other loosely clasping his helmet on his lap. Keith felt his heart go out to him as he approached. He did not look good. Lance, hey, he said, warning him that he was there. Hey, he said, warning him that he was there, knowing by this time that Lance's startle reflex could be a swing to his face. He went to his knees in front of Lance, reaching behind to cup a hand over his at the back of his neck. I got you. Keith? Lance said wearily and incredulously, and Keith felt himself steadied a little. It was always good to hear that Lance remembered his name. Come on, don't. The hand under Keith's on Lance's neck raised, pushing him off, setting all his emotions adrift. Had he hurt him by touching him? Lance muttered something that Keith couldn't hear, making him lean in close. What? Keith asked, studying Lance's face, worried that he wouldn't lift his gaze. Did I hurt you? Can you... Let me see your eyes. Oh my God, Keith, Lance grumbled, visibly tensing up. Just look at me, damn it! Blue growled at Keith's raised voice, but he ignored him. The real ones, not the copied mangled ones he'd seen on Malaya. Without thinking, he reached forward to take Lance's chin in his fingers, tipping it from where Lance had it tucked to his chest. Open your eyes, Lance! Keith barked at him, keeping firm hold even as Lance tried to twist out of his hand. He pinned Lance down with his other hand on his shoulder, at war with himself about how he might be overreacting. But no, he didn't think so. Everyone else could ignore what was going on, but they hadn't been there. They hadn't seen Lance at his weakest, didn't understand the changes Keith could see in him now. They might not be paying attention, but he was, and he was not going to let Lance suffer now that they were still, now that they had a minute to figure it out. Come on, he amended, trying to be gentler and not quite getting it. Lance took a weird, hitching breath, but at last he complied, Keith shifted their position until he had Lance's face between his palms, thumbs at the corners of his eyes. He complied. Keith shifted their position until he had Lance's face between his palms, thumbs at the corners of his eyes. Too close for comfort, but there was no such thing as personal space between them anymore. At least, not for Keith. Lance lifted a hand, hanging his fingers loosely on Keith's wrist. "You happy now?" Lance asked, probably trying to be flippant, but Keith didn't buy it. He might be trying to hide, obviously struggling to keep eye contact, but he was wide open to Keith right now. The blue eyes were clear and deep and hurting. Lance could see, but he was definitely in pain. "No," Keith grunted. How come Lance didn't understand that Keith took no enjoyment in his misery? "What's wrong? Can you stand up?" "Let's stand up. I'll help you to the medroom." Karan was still helping Alora, but he'd probably be finished by the time Keith got Lance over there. Could he walk, though? Both his hands on Keith's wrists now, and shoving him weakly backward. His eyes teared up before he closed them again, shutting down completely, leaning his head against Blue. "Please?" Keith was taken aback momentarily before reminding himself that this wasn't really Lance talking here. The words were an artifact of some internal damage, a bruise, a broken neural pathway, something they needed to fix soon, since it seemed as though it kept getting worse the longer they left it alone. He just needed to persuade Lance back into a healing pod. "Okay," Keith eased, for once in his life annoyed that communication wasn't a particular talent of his. "So listen, I wasn't going to tell you this, but earlier when you fell into the canyon with Blue the first time, you hit your head hard, and Karan said, 'Leave me alone, Keith,'" Lance begged tiredly. "Yeah," Keith agreed, though his soul brought up the last time Lance had asked this, how he had not meant it at all, how he'd broken when he thought that Keith had actually done it, how Keith had promised himself that he'd never leave Lance alone again. "Just let me help you first." "I really don't need your help." "Hey, Keith, back off, man." Keith jumped at Hunk's voice behind him, then bristled. When did he get here? And Pidge. She also appeared out of nowhere, tucking into Lance's side, her arms slipping around his chest. He tipped his head toward her when she began murmuring, her face against his breastplate, his face relaxing into relief. What the hell? "Lance?" Keith began, feeling slighted. "It's all right," Hunk assured him, physically pulling him to his feet and away from the Blue Paladin, placing himself as an immovable barrier between them. "We've got him." But, Keith protested, losing his grip on reality, leaning to maintain visual on Lance from around Hunk's back. They just didn't understand. No one was looking at Lance right. No one was listening. "We've got him," Hunk said again, turning his attention away from Keith and bending down to help Lance off the floor. Keith watched, completely astonished, as Lance allowed himself to be lifted, then cradled between Hunk and Pidge, his face deliberately turned away from Keith. "Give us some space," Pidge dismissed, but he didn't want to. He stood there, mouth agape, staring at the closed trio, and he wanted to fight someone. He was supposed to be there. He was Lance's support. He was the only one who really knew what was going on. A few hours ago, Pidge had been screaming profanity at him. How come no one was bringing that up? How come she was allowed to just touch him now? What had Keith done to you? And how come he was so mad about it? Since when did he care what Lance thought of him, what anyone thought of him? He was missing the point. It didn't matter who took Lance to the healing pods, provided he get there. "Fine," he said stiffly, the ache in his chest magnifying as he said it. "I'll go find Karan. Meet you in the bedroom." Hunk and Pidge exchanged puzzled glances, but Keith had a mission now, and he suddenly didn't want to look at them anymore. So he stalked out, hurting in a nondescript, unintelligible way. "It's nothing personal," he told himself forcefully. "You know he's not right. You know something's wrong with his head. You know he can't remember a thing about before. It has nothing to do with you." It didn't help. He was still pissed. He fumed about it through the castle, focused so hard on what had just happened that when he lifted his head he discovered he'd been fury marching the wrong way. It figured. He couldn't focus his thoughts either. The one question kept circling around. What had he done to make Lance hate him so much? There'd been hostility before they'd even been really introduced. Like Lance had a grudge from a fight Keith hadn't even participated in. It had put him on the defensive, sure, but to be so antagonistic as to not even be able to look at him, come on. And how come he couldn't see that Keith was just trying to help, that Keith was trying to be gentle, that he was worried about him, that he actually cared? He stopped dead, looking around as if someone had caught him admitting that to himself. His arms crossed over his chest protectively as a chill of something he couldn't identify washed over him. Loss, maybe? He was horrible at this, but his insides roiled all of a sudden like he was in danger. But that was stupid. He was alone in the castle hall. He dropped his arms, beginning to move again purposefully, forcefully, the way he needed to when things were getting overwhelming. Despite the unexpected detour and pause, Kiran remained at Alora's bedside by the time Keith knocked on the door. Well, sort of knocked. It still counted as knocking even if you did it while opening the door, right? "Keith, what is it?" Kiran asked, surprised, half standing. The room was soothingly dark, only a few faintly crystalline lights glowing. All 4 of the castle mice snuggled on the bed. Alora began to sit up at his unexpected arrival, but Kiran put a hand out to stop her, almost pushing her forcefully back into her pillows. His face suggested that Keith had better have a very good reason for disturbing them. "It's Lance," Keith revealed, gesturing behind him toward the hallway. "He needs a healing pod. I need you to come with me to configure it." "Lance?" Alora questioned quietly. The mice began to chitter. Kiran looked doubtful, a look that Keith was starting to resent. Was he not going to believe him again? After all they'd been through today? Or yesterday? Or however long it had been since this started? "I didn't know he'd been hurt," Kiran said, standing fully now, but bending over Alora, the only one in the room who looked properly concerned. "I thought we'd made it out all right." "Hunk and Pidge are helping him to the medroom," Keith explained. "There's still something wrong, Kiran. With his head, I think. He was on the floor." His eyes were closed. He wouldn't look at me. He's too damn quiet, and I hate it. More than when he wouldn't shut up. And if anything is going to be right about my life again, then I really need you to make him normal. The level of pain in his eyes is not acceptable, and I don't know why no one else can see it, but it needs to be fixed. Now." Keith, Kiran began, rather gently for someone not used to easing hard truths. Keith heard what he was going to say before he started. He'd already been told that there was a chance it wouldn't work. He already knew that if it could have been fixed by the healing pods, it would have been done. There wasn't a point to going another round, having another treatment. That's not how the pods work, he heard Kiran lecture in his mind. "There's something wrong," he repeated uncompromisingly. "Do not dismiss it. Another scan won't hurt," he added pleadingly. Kiran looked on Alora for a long time before she nodded. "All right, then," Kiran relented, finally taking a step backward from the bed. "You're right. No harm in checking." Keith took his first easy breath in the past hour, pushing to open the door for Kiran to exit first, grateful that he wasn't going to be ignored. "Keith," the princess called from the shadows of her bed, paused. "Please, won't you stay?" Keith began, trying to find a good way of saying that he absolutely did not want to stay. Then he saw how Kiran glared at him, and knew that he was not leaving the room if Alora didn't want him to. "Sure," he relented, pretending it had been his choice. Whatever he had to do to make sure Kiran went to help Lance. Besides, he thought bitterly as he began crossing the room to take Kiran's place, it's not like Lance would want him there anyway. The door closed as he reached the side of the bed, where he continued to stand as the mice settled down again, no stranger to awkward silences. Keith glanced at Alora, noticing the droop of her eyes, the tired slack in her mouth. the slight distress that she was stuck in bed when it was clear she needed to be up and defending the universe against the terror of the Galra dictatorship. Keith cleared his throat and looked away. Keith, I can't tell you. Cleared his throat and looked away. Keith, I can't tell you how sorry I am. Oh, no. The tears were in her voice again. Keith folded his arms, shifting uncomfortably on his feet, keeping his eyes on the ground. Forget it, he instructed callously, feeling conflicted about it. That's the one thing I cannot do, Elora protested, making Keith groan inwardly. He had a hard time wrapping his mind around Elora's sense of integrity, her self-imposed moral obligations to the cosmos, like everything bad that happened was a direct result of her failure. That poor planet. You mean the one that tried to kill us? Keith clarified, trying to bring some perspective to her despair. That wasn't what it was trying to do, Elora countered, a slight bite cutting through the tears. Yes, that's better, Elora. He almost wanted to start an argument about it. It was just trying to survive. You can't save them all, Elora, Keith said flatly. I know that, she shot back. That doesn't mean I should stop trying. Her voice cracked. He felt her turn away, making him feel safe enough to steal another glance at her. He hadn't heard her sit up, but she was, one hand holding her blanket against her torso, the other supporting her on the mattress. The mice clustered around her fingers, giving whatever comfort a mouse is capable of. Not that it's doing much good, she whispered, enlightening Keith suddenly to the fact that she might ever even think like that, like she ever had a moment of doubt. You know, the Galra have had the run of the universe for a long time now, Keith pointed out, annoyed by more than what he was saying. What did you think? That you'd wake up, grab a bunch of misfits, and have it all fixed by lunch? Of course not, Elora protested weakly. But then stop holding yourself to this impossible standard. You can do things I've never seen before, but there's only one of you. Red told me we'd basically have to sacrifice a sun to that planet to get enough energy to reverse what happened there. You would have killed yourself and still not succeeded. And then where would the universe be? Somewhere in his tirade they'd made eye contact and held it, though Elora's gaze grew wider with every word, her mouth partly open. It made Keith falter, suddenly confused. Where was this even coming from? He plunked down in the chair that Karan had drawn close to the bed, resting his elbows on his knees, lowering his head. Keith, Elora said, in a tone so complex that Keith had no idea what he should think of it. Hopefully she was about to ask him to leave. I'm sorry, he replied reflexively, though if she'd pressed him on why, he wouldn't have been able to tell her. It just seemed he'd verbally backed himself into a corner, quickest way out. It just seems stupid to die for nothing. Is that what you think? That what I did was for nothing? Keith couldn't answer that. To be honest, he still wasn't quite sure what it was that she'd done. He just knew that she was responsible for Pidge having her lion back, for him not being turned into dust in the darkness with Red. That doesn't seem fair, coming from you. I know you saved me, he allowed, trying not to flinch as she reached out to place her hand on his arm. Thanks, he finished, knowing how pathetic it was. That's not what I meant. You saved yourself, she countered. You were the one who thought to concentrate and reach out to me. You remembered that my life force was connected to the Red Lion, and you could use it as a direct line back to us. I didn't even know where to start looking for you. Keith's mouth twisted in wonder and shame. He hadn't even thought of that. He'd just been furious and frightened. His rescue suddenly been a dedicated act on either of their parts. He relaxed his arm where she touched him. What I meant, Elora went on, is I'm not the only one taking potentially fatal risks trying to save someone. Huh? Keith didn't mean to vocalize his bewilderment, but it slipped out somehow anyway. Lance, Elora reminded him. Don't you know how crazy that was to jump after him? You had no idea what was even down there, if you'd survived the fall. I dare say you didn't take even a second to think about it, and you came out of it in worse shape than I am. There's only one of you as well, you know. Keith heard himself inhale slowly. He wasn't sure he liked where this conversation was going. He certainly didn't see it the same way she did. There wasn't really a comparison for him going after his teammate, someone he knew, someone they needed, and what she'd given of her quintessence to Malaya. Right? It's not the same thing, quintessence to Malaya. Right? It's not the same thing, he argued. We need Lance, or we can't form Voltron. We all know that. But you're the only one who jumped. There wasn't any time, he defended, unsure how he'd become the focus of the lecture, why she was making a bigger deal out of this than it needed to be. It felt like she was trying to crack him open, the way he'd been before in the hall alone. He did not like it. My point, Elora went on, softening, is that sometimes the need is greater than the risk. That's something I should have thought about before, when you were both down there and I wasn't willing to come and get you. You were right then, and now, and I will be a better listener to you in the future. It looks as though we will need to help each other gauge that balance on when we should act in our own best interests or for others. I think we agree that sacrifice for the greater good is allowable only if we would come of the sacrifice. Greater good, Keith repeated, skeptical if it would always be clear what that would be, but glad that Elora seemed so certain about it. He didn't know why, because sometimes it made him angry, but there was a small comfort in feeling like Elora had the answers. Yes, exactly, Elora smiled tiredly. In my case, my all would have done nothing. At least your endeavor was worthwhile. I'm not so sure, Keith admitted, surprising himself in his openness. He hadn't actually done anything to save Lance. They'd already discussed this, and judging from how he'd looked the last time Keith had seen him, it was rather ambiguous on whether he'd been saved at all. What do you mean? Elora asked, her helpful nature rising to the surface despite her exhaustion. She probably didn't even realize she was doing it again, pushing aside her need for rest to try and figure out a problem Keith wasn't even addressing properly himself. A knock on Elora's door thankfully stopped the conversation, Hunk entering with a tray. Oh, he said, taking in the scene, Keith at the bed, Elora's hand still on his arm. Keith stood up immediately. Hey, didn't mean to interrupt. Thought you'd like some soup. It's okay, Keith said, relieved. We're done. He slipped out from under Elora's fingers, moving toward the door. Hunk's presence here meant that whatever had happened in the med room was finished. Lance was safe in a healing pod. How's Lance? Yeah, Hunk said slowly, as if he didn't want to say. He busied himself by going to Elora, carefully setting the tray across her lap so as not to spill anything. It's a little hot, he cautioned her while she beamed up at him affectionately. Thank you, Hunk, she said, as Keith felt himself going invisible on the sidelines, getting impatient. How bad was it? What happened? You bet, Hunk returned as Keith realized he was drumming his fingers on his bicep. Hunk, he quipped sharply. Lance? I'll come back for the tray later, Hunk continued, as if he hadn't heard a thing. By this time, Keith was fed up trying to get an answer. It was simple enough. If he were going to be ignored, he'd just go check on his own. Whatever, he huffed in annoyance, waving dismissively and turning toward the door. Hey, Keith! Hunk called after him as he stepped into the hallway. Wait! Nope, he said to himself, purposefully putting his foot down. Why wouldn't anyone tell him anything? Hold up! Hunk puffed, chasing him down the corridor. Keith felt his nostrils flare as he took a deep breath, shoving his hands in his pockets. He paused, then attacked. Are you going to answer me now? Keith rounded on the yellow paladin, worry making his voice harsh again. Hunk shuffled to a stop in front of him, his face nothing but pity. How bad is it? Is Lance okay? It's nothing but pity. How bad is it? Is Lance okay? Dude, Lance is fine, Hunk said, which was, of course, a complete and total lie. Keith surprised them both by lashing out and grabbing a fistful of Hunk's shirt, twisting it hard. Don't give me that, he shouted. I saw him, remember? On the floor? Couldn't stand up by himself? I saw his eyes, Hunk. Now what happened to him? Where is he? Calm down, Hunk instructed, plucking Keith off of him without seeming to exert any effort at all. He's in his room, resting. Healing pod exhaustion is a thing, remember? We talked about this. Keith mouthed the words in repeat. Healing pod exhaustion. What? No, that wasn't it. Had they even done a scan like you told them? No, he denied, still upset. No, there's something else. Hunk was staring at him, studying, his mouth set in a funny way. We ran. It came back clean, Hunk stated, infuriatingly. Why are you so mad? Because it's wrong, Keith maintained. He's different. His brain is still messed up. Can't you even tell? I thought you were friends. He's not different, Hunk denied, and now Keith really wanted to hit him. How could he stand there and lie like that? Or was he really that dense, that imperceptive? Keith thought he missed a lot of subtleties most of the time, but to miss something like this... But you are. Hunk. Keith spat out his name with the last of his patience, a warning. Come with me, Hunk invited.